The pandemic exposed the great inequities in our society, and certainly in education. Many of us know that in the spring, millions of kids in the United States and in many countries throughout the world could not participate in any learning at all because they don't have access to the internet in their homes, or because they don't have screens which to use for learning. Both problems are related to poverty and what we call the digital divide. On top of that, most schools were not prepared for what occurred, and so they did not provide real guidance to teachers on how to use the technology or how to deliver meaningful instruction to kids. So, particularly our most vulnerable kids, kids who are with learning disabilities, and children who are homeless in the United States, or children who are in circumstances that are overcrowded apartments and the like, really were at a huge disadvantage and experienced tremendous learning loss. Now the policymakers have realized that it's really impossible to restart the economy, if that's even possible, without reopening schools. Otherwise, it will be unsupervised. So there's been a pressure on school districts to open, but without guidance coming from the federal government or from the states. And that means each district on their own is trying to figure this out and how best to meet the needs of its students and of its staff, because as we know, older people are more vulnerable. And this has created a huge problem across the country, because without proper guidance, schools are left on their own to figure out how to make this work. Teachers have recently announced, the teacher unions, that they will go on strike if their members are forced to work under unsafe conditions. So we're headed for what could be a huge crisis in education. That there has not been the kind of funding required to open schools safely in many districts and in many states. And so the absence of leadership in Washington and at the state level, I think, has created this crisis. We know that several countries that have opened schools prematurely have seen a rise in cases, such as Israel. We also know there are countries that have done this well that we could learn from, such as New Zealand and Denmark and Canada. And so the real question, I think, facing the United States is, when will leadership emerge that can provide the guidance that schools need on how to manage instruction appropriately and safely, and how to reopen schools when it's appropriate, in a manner that does not place lives at risk. The leading high-tech firms were in Washington taking questions from Congress. And that was one of the questions that was posed, is their responsibility, since, as we know, they have accumulated huge profits during this pandemic, particularly Amazon, because of home delivery. And they have a responsibility here to assist. We hear now they're talking about that, but it may be too late for many families. So in the absence of support from the private sector, it will again fall on local school districts. Now, districts will have to be creative without the resources. In some parts of the country, such as California, learning outside might be a practical way to address this problem, as long as you can ensure that kids won't get burned up by the sun. We know that learning or gathering outdoors is a lower risk activity. In areas where the virus is below, the rate of infection is below 5%, it might be possible for children to return to school. So there are guidelines on how to do this safely. There's a surge, and we're seeing a surge in cases, for example, in many areas, and agricultural workers being impacted in particular, such as the Imperial Valley in Southern California, then we're going to have to rely on community organizations like nonprofits and churches to step up to support families to deliver education to children in concert with the school districts. So I would say that districts will have to turn to their local communities, turn to their families to ensure access. It's not ideal by any means, but the alternative is to do nothing. And I think doing nothing would be irresponsible.